All right, strap in, everyone. We're going deep on this one.
Oh, yeah.
We're diving into the mind of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz today.
A philosophical giant.
Absolutely. You sent us some incredible excerpts, dissertation on predestination and grace, philosophical texts, and
The labyrinth of the continuum.
that's the one. So much to unpack.
Yeah, a real philosophical feast.
But that's why we're here, right?
Yeah.
To break it down, to find those golden nuggets of Leibniz's thought.
And see how they still resonate centuries later.
Exactly. What I find fascinating, and this is something that jumps out from these sources, is that Leibniz wasn't just, philosophizing in some ivory tower.
Oh, not at all.
He was really in the thick of things,
Mhm.
especially the religious debates of his time.
Very true, especially the attempts to reunite the Protestant and Catholic churches.
Right. He was really trying to bridge that divide, like in 1698 when he sent that memo to Bishop von Buchan.
Oh, with practical steps for reunification?
Exactly. And then he even traveled to Vienna in 1700 to talk about it with the bishop in person. This is a time, with all the fallout from the conversion of the Elector of Saxony to Catholicism.
A lot of tension.
Absolutely. The Protestant electorates were shrinking. There was pressure to convert. So for Leibniz to try and find common ground, well, it was pretty audacious.
It really was. It shows just how deeply he cared about unity, about bringing people together.
It does. So how did this desire for unity play out in his own thinking, in his philosophy and theology?
Well, let's take the example of predestination and grace. It was a major point of contention in his time.
A theological battleground.
You could say that. And Leibniz was navigating between two very different camps.
You have the Reformed theologians, right? The ones who believed in absolute predestination. God decides everything, who is saved, who isn't.
And on the other hand, there were those who argued that God considers what we might call contingent facts, the potential choices we might make when choosing the elect.
So it's not just a fixed list. God takes into account our potential actions.
Right. And this view actually finds some support in Scripture. Romans 8.3031 seems to connect God's foreknowledge of who will have faith to their predestination.
Interesting. It's a verse that sparked countless debates.
Definitely still debated to this day.
So where did Leibniz fall on this? Absolute decree or this more dynamic view of God's choice?
Well, Leibniz, always the master of nuance.
Of course.
He saw a middle ground. He distinguished between God's preceptive will, which is what God commands,
Okay.
and God's decretive will, what God actually brings about.
So like a company setting goals versus actually achieving them. Two different levels of intention and outcome.
A perfect analogy.
And this reminds me of his distinction between antecedent will and consequent will, right?
Exactly. Antecedent will being like a general desire for good, while the consequent will takes into account all the complexities of reality.
And chooses what's best overall.
Even if it means allowing some imperfection.
Fascinating. So he was trying to balance God's power and knowledge with the idea that we still have a part to play, that our choices matter.
Exactly.
But what about irresistible grace? Didn't some theologians believe that once God chose you, you were like automatically saved?
Yes, that was a central tenet for many, but Leibniz was hesitant to fully embrace it.
He wasn't convinced.
He leaned more towards the Arminian view, which emphasizes human freedom in the process of salvation.
So we have a say in it.
Precisely. He preferred terms like infallibly efficacious to describe grace.
Infallibly efficacious.
It acknowledges its power, but still leaves room for free will.
Okay, I'm following you. God's grace is powerful, but we can still accept or reject it.
Exactly.
It seems like this idea of human agency pops up a lot in Leibniz's thinking.
You're absolutely right, and it's especially prominent in his concept of spontaneity.
Spontaneity. So, acting on a whim.
Not exactly. For Leibniz, spontaneity means that actions originate from internal forces.
Okay.
They're not just determined by external causes.
So, like, if I choose to eat pizza for dinner instead of salad because I really crave pizza.
So that's a good example. It's not just about following a whim. It's acting from an inner drive.
So my love for pizza is an internal force.
You could say that. And think about it on a grander scale. God's creation of the universe, it wasn't prompted by any external force.
Ah, I see.
It was a spontaneous act arising from his own internal nature.
So spontaneity applies to, like, divine actions and our everyday choices.
Exactly. It's a fundamental part of his philosophy.
And it leads him to challenge some other big thinkers of his time,
It
right?
does, like his critique of occasionalism.
Occasionalism, what is that?
Well, sometimes it's called the Cartesian doctrine.
After Descartes.
Right. It basically says that God is the sole cause in the universe.
Okay.
Everything else is just an occasion for his action.
So, like, if I trip over a rock, it's not really the rock's fault, but God directly making me fall.
That's a good way to put it. Basically, material bodies and even our minds are completely passive.
Wow. Like puppets in a cosmic play, almost.
Exactly, and Leibniz strongly disagreed with this view. One of his main objections was that it makes material bodies and human minds utterly inactive.
They just sit there doing nothing.
Right. He argued that both possess inherent internal forces and activities.
So we're not just puppets dancing to God's tune. We have a genuine capacity for independent action and choice.
Exactly.
That opens up some big questions about cause and effect in the universe. If God isn't directly causing everything, then how does it all work?
That's where things get really interesting. Leibniz used his concept of spontaneity to try to explain the active roles of both humans and God in the world.
This is all pretty mind-blowing stuff. We've only just scratched the surface of Leibniz's thought. What other fascinating ideas await us in this deep dive?
Well, you mentioned something earlier that leads us perfectly to our next topic, those mind-boggling monads. Get ready
Right.
because this is where things get really interesting.
All right, monads. They sound kind of like something out of, I don't know, science fiction.
Right.
Before we go any further, remind me again, what are these monads exactly?
So imagine the universe like a tapestry. It's woven from these countless tiny threads.
Okay,
Each thread is a monad, a simple, indivisible, indestructible unit of reality. And it has its own internal force, its own activity.
so like miniature universes.
Exactly, each reflecting the whole, but with different levels of clarity.
Okay, so they're not physical things.
Yeah.
Not like atoms, right?
Right. Leibniz actually rejected the idea of material atoms being the fundamental building blocks.
Interesting. So what did he think matter was made of?
Well, he saw matter itself as kind of a phenomenon, arising from the interaction of these countless monads.
So like a grand illusion.
You could say that.
Yeah.
Orchestrated by this pre-established harmony.
Okay, now that's a pretty wild concept. It's like saying the physical world we experience is just like this elaborate projection coming from these tiny, non-physical things.
It was a wild concept.
Yeah, how does that even work? How do these monads interact if they're not physical?
Imagine a perfectly synchronized dance. Each monad follows its own internal rhythm. But God has set it up so that they all move in harmony.
Creating the illusion of a unified physical world.
Precisely. It's like an orchestra. Each instrument plays its own part, but together they make this beautiful symphony.
So no physical interaction, but just this pre-programmed harmony.
Yeah.
Making sure everything happens in a perfectly coordinated way.
That's the idea.
That's definitely a unique way of looking at things.
Yeah.
And this idea of pre-established harmony, it also plays a part in how he dealt with the problem of evil, right?
It does. Remember, Leibniz believed we live in the best of all possible worlds.
Even though there's clearly a lot of bad stuff happening,
Exactly. It's a concept that a lot of people struggle with.
it does seem kind of counterintuitive.
Right. But Leibniz argued that God, being all-powerful and all good,
You wouldn't create a flawed world on purpose.
exactly. He chose the best possible world from all the options.
The one that maximized good, minimized evil. But wouldn't a world without any evil be better, by definition? How can a world with suffering be the best?
Well, Leibniz suggested that maybe certain kinds of good can only exist if there's also evil present.
I've never thought about it like that.
Think of a world where everyone always does the right thing, automatically without even thinking about it. Would those actions really be morally meaningful?
That's a good point. I guess it's like saying true courage can only exist if there's danger to overcome.
Right. You need the possibility of bad choices for good choices to have real weight.
So, in a way, evil is a necessary consequence of free will.
Exactly. It's a trade-off, but one that ultimately leads to a greater good.
Still a tough pill to swallow, but I'm starting to see his logic.
It's definitely a complex concept. And Leibniz faced criticism from other philosophers who questioned this whole best of all possible worlds idea.
Well, I'm sure he did. Who were some of his biggest critics?
One of the most vocal was Pierre Bayle, a philosopher known for, well, being pretty critical.
I see.
Bayle argued that if God could choose between different possible worlds...
He wouldn't have picked one with so much suffering.
Exactly. He found it hard to reconcile a benevolent God with all the evil in the world.
So he thought Leibniz's explanation wasn't really an explanation.
He presented a strong counter-argument, that's for sure. But in his responses, Leibniz emphasized that God's choice wasn't arbitrary.
Not random.
Right. It was based on reason, on a desire for the greatest good overall, considering all the possible factors and consequences.
So it's not like God just flipped a coin and said, okay, this world gets some suffering, but hey, it's still pretty good.
Yeah,
There was a deeper reason behind it.
exactly. And Leibniz also pointed out that our human perspective is limited.
We don't see the whole picture
Right. We tend to focus on the negative, on the suffering we see.
without understanding the bigger context.
Precisely. He believed that if we could see the world from God's perspective, with all its complexity and long-term consequences,
We would understand why this world, with all its flaws, is the best possible one.
that was his argument.
I guess that brings us back to free will. How did Leibniz reconcile our ability to make choices with this idea that God has already chosen the best possible world? A world where, presumably, everything is predetermined.
The million-dollar question. It does seem like a paradox.
Right. If God knows everything that's going to happen, are we really making our own choices?
Leibniz argued that God's foreknowledge doesn't negate free will. Imagine God seeing all possible timelines unfolding like branches on a tree.
Okay, I'm visualizing it.
Our choices determine which path we take, which timeline becomes real.
So God sees all the possibilities, but we're still the ones steering the ship, so to speak.
A great analogy. Leibniz believed our choices have real consequences, even if God understands all the potential outcomes.
His knowledge doesn't force our hand, it just acknowledges all the possibilities.
Exactly.
That makes sense, but it's still mind-bending.
It is a complex idea, and Leibniz's whole philosophical system hinges on this delicate balance between divine power and human agency.
It does seem like that tension runs through a lot of his work.
It does. And it even informs his understanding of, well, something that might seem completely unrelated, the nature of space and matter.
Wait, what? How does space and matter fit into all of this? It feels like we're changing the subject.
It's not a change of subject, but a fascinating connection. Remember that Herculean argument we talked about, where Leibniz said that if something can't be perceived, it doesn't exist?
Right, the one that sounds like it involves superhuman strength.
That's the one. Well, that idea is central to his views on space and matter.
Okay, remind me again what that argument was about.
The Herculean argument basically says that anything that's impossible to perceive, whether it exists or not, is nothing. It makes us think about the relationship between what we perceive and what's actually real.
So if we can't perceive it, it's not real. That's a bold statement.
It is. But Leibniz wasn't saying that the physical world is just an illusion.
Okay.
He was exploring the idea that what we perceive isn't just a passive reflection of some external world, but an active construction of our minds.
So our minds are shaping our experience of reality.
Exactly. And this led him to challenge traditional ideas about space and matter. He disagreed with the view that space is this absolute independent thing, like an empty container holding everything.
He didn't like the empty space idea.
He believed space is relational. It comes from the relationships between objects. He used the analogy of a net.
A net.
Imagine a net with knots representing objects. The net itself, the space, is defined by the connections between those knots. No knots, no net.
Okay, so space isn't this vast emptiness, but a web of connections.
Exactly. And if space is relational, it can't be perceived apart from the objects in it. We experience space through the things within it.
That's fascinating. So what about matter? Is he saying matter is relational too?
In a sense, yes. Leibniz argued that matter, like space, doesn't exist independently of perception. He believed that matter is ultimately made up of monads, those tiny units of perception and activity we talked about earlier.
So those mind-boggling monads are at the heart of it all. Space and matter arising from their interaction.
You got it. It's like saying the physical world isn't so much stuff as it is this grand symphony of perceptions orchestrated by these tiny, non-physical entities.
Wow, this is really making me rethink my whole understanding of, well, everything.
That's the power of Leibniz. He challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. He argued that the material world isn't this separate, objective realm independent of minds.
It's a product of how our minds perceive the universe, based on the underlying structure of those monads.
Exactly.
My simple view of space and matter is officially blown to pieces.
And that's just the beginning. Leibniz took his Herculean argument and applied it to the very fabric of reality. His views on space and matter continue to spark debate and new ways of thinking about the universe.
I can imagine. We've been exploring these complex ideas for a while now, and I wouldn't blame you if your brain is feeling a little overloaded.
A little bit.
Maybe we should take a short break before we go any deeper into this labyrinth of Leibniz's thought.
Right.
All right, let's dive back into the world of Leibniz. We've talked about predestination, free will, the nature of space and matter, and now we're adding another layer to this philosophical cake calculus.
You got it. Leibniz, along with Isaac Newton, is credited with developing this fundamental branch of mathematics.
Calculus. It seems like a big jump from metaphysics and theology.
It might seem that way.
But for Leibniz, it was all connected, wasn't it?
Absolutely. He didn't see these areas as separate. He viewed mathematics as a powerful tool, a way to understand the structure of reality itself.
So calculus wasn't just about, crunching numbers.
No, not just that. He saw it as a language that could express the underlying order and harmony of the universe.
So it was a way for him to explore those grand philosophical ideas we've been discussing.
Exactly. And his work on calculus, particularly his development of infinitesimals, was truly groundbreaking.
Okay, infinitesimals. Break this down for me. What are they and how do they fit into all of this?
Imagine you're trying to describe the speed of a car that's constantly accelerating and decelerating. Calculus gives you the tools to do that, and infinitesimals are a key part of that toolbox.
Oh.
They're these incredibly small quantities, approaching zero, but not quite zero.
Okay.
They allow us to break down complex curves and motions into, well, infinitely small segments.
So by using these super tiny units, Leibniz could analyze change and motion with incredible precision.
That's a great way to think about it. It's like using a super-powered microscope to examine the tiniest details of movement.
I like that analogy, and it makes me think about how Leibniz viewed the universe as this tapestry woven from countless monads. There's a parallel there, isn't there?
Absolutely. Just as infinitesimals break down complex motions into their simplest components.
Monads represent the fundamental building blocks of reality itself.
Exactly. They operate on different levels, of course. Infinitesimals in the realm of mathematics, monads as these metaphysical entities.
Right. But both reflect Leibniz's belief in this underlying order and harmony in the universe.
Exactly. Just as he saw the universe as this grand interplay of countless monads.
He saw calculus as a way of expressing the harmony and order of change and motion in the natural world.
Beautifully put. This is what makes Leibniz so remarkable. He wasn't just a philosopher or a mathematician.
He was both.
He was a true polymath. He excelled in so many areas and saw connections that others missed.
It's inspiring to think about how one person could make such a huge impact on so many different fields.
It is. And what's even more impressive is that he wasn't afraid to tackle the big questions.
The nature of reality, God, the problem of evil, free will.
All of it. And his ideas, even centuries later, continue to challenge us, to push us to think in new ways.
It's amazing how relevant his work still is.
And that's the beauty of philosophy, isn't it? It's not just about memorizing facts or theories. It's about engaging with these enduring questions.
Questions that have fascinated thinkers for generations.
Exactly. It's about expanding our horizons, challenging assumptions, and deepening our understanding of ourselves and the universe we live in.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the world of Leibniz. His views on predestination and grace, his concept of spontaneity.
His groundbreaking work on calculus, the mind-boggling monadology.
So much to unpack.
It's been quite a journey.
My brain is definitely feeling a little fried right now, but in a good way. My understanding of philosophy has been stretched and expanded.
That's what it's all about, growth and transformation.
Pushing us beyond our comfort zones, helping us see the world in new ways.
Exactly.
Before we wrap up this deep dive into Leibniz's world, I'd like to leave our listeners with a final thought, something to ponder.
Sounds good.
If we truly live in the best of all possible worlds, as Leibniz argued, what does that mean for how we understand suffering? And maybe even more importantly, what does it say about our responsibility to make the world a better place?
That's a powerful question. It really gets to the heart of Leibniz's philosophy. It makes us think about how we can reconcile the idea of a perfect creation with all the imperfection and suffering we see in the world.
It challenges us to think about what role we play in shaping the world around us.
It does.
Maybe by wrestling with these questions, we can find a way to make the world, well, if not the best, at least a little bit better.
That's a sentiment that aligns with Leibniz's own belief in progress and improvement. Even within the best possible world, there's always room for growth, for making things better.
So to our listeners, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep striving for a better world.
And never underestimate the power of ideas.
Ideas to shape the course of history. And until next time, keep diving deep.